Big Don Pryor, back from the sunny island of Maui, where you underwent a number of very interesting once-in-a-lifetime events, not all of the most positive quality. Welcome back. Glad you're here. And anything you want to share with our vast audience about that experience?
I do have a few thoughts that we could pontificate about. Yeah, as I'm sure everyone knows, there was a huge fire in Lahaina, Maui that burned almost the entire city to the ground. Turns out we live in a very connected world, and it is difficult to do much of anything if you have no power, no internet, no cell service, no access to the roads, no stores, and no gas stations.
True enough.
A lot of people lost their homes, lost their cars, lost loved ones, lost their jobs. We were very fortunate that we were north of the fire and we were safe. Our place was okay. I was driving through that area earlier in the day, and I could very well have ended up stuck in the middle of Lahaina. There was no warning. If you know that Maui has one of the largest network of sirens and alerts, and the decision was made, the knucklehead decision was made not to sound the sirens because they're generally for hurricanes and they don't want people running up into the mountains where the fires were, as if people were going to run up into a fire. Things can change in a moment. Our friends, we went to sleep not even knowing about the fire because we lost power, we lost internet service, and 3 p.m. last we knew the fires were contained and our cell phones went down. So we had no way of knowing. Our friends whose house was in the area where everything burnt down, they thought their house had burned down. Turns out it did not. As one of the few to survive. They still can't live in it, but they went to bed not knowing. And the only reason that they realized something was going on is because there was somebody fighting in the street. Like apparently somebody wanted to run back in and get something, and they were yelling and fighting about not going back into the house. And all they could hear you'd think the police would be going door to door, knocking and saying, "You need to evacuate." No, they were in a car going. And I've heard multiple reports of this, including from my friends.
Like they couldn't hear it when it was unintelligible.
It was unintelligible. They couldn't even hear it in their bedroom. So they were one of the last to evacuate. So, thankful our friends are okay. They were able to escape with their kitty. We were able to take them in. We were okay, but we were without power for 5 days. I'm surprised it came back on that quickly. There was no cell service, zero. The first day I was able to take my mountain bike because the roads were closed and jammed with traffic. I knew I wasn't going to be able to drive anywhere. So I took my mountain bike up a hill, and I got to a point where, 2 out of every 5 text messages I sent might go through, and I had to keep trying to resend them. So at least could let some people know that we were safe. Ultimately, we found that if we drove up to the Kapalua airport, which is, a mile from my house, up the hill, that we'd get a lot more, no internet, but we could get most text messages to go out. Probably not too many phone calls because they would drop. 2 weeks into it, we were able to get cell signals closer to our house, still no internet. You could generally text, not in the house, like we had to walk down to the beach or walk into the cul-de-sac. But if there's one good thing about this disaster is that it brought a lot of people together. Like, I think if this had happened on the mainland, you'd have people fighting over toilet paper in the aisles. And on Maui, there were people immediately, there was no government. People were bringing supplies, like convoys of supplies when they could get through the roads. People with airplanes were flying in from the other side of the island to the Kapalua airport. People with boats were coming in from Lanai and Molokai, which are the closest 2 islands. Multiple local people set up state aid stations at the local beach park. So there was one right down the street from us. There was one up in Napili. They popped up all over the place, and just anybody who needed food and water should have been able to get it there. No questions asked. And funny to think that a couple of weeks before I went to Maui, we had a big thunderstorm in Michigan that knocked out our power. And normally in our neighborhood, we don't lose power very often, but this storm knocked out our power for 5 days, knocked out our internet for 5 days. You think, normally I think, well, gee, the internet's down. It's no big deal. I got a cell phone. I'll just get it. Turns out when the Comcast goes down and everybody gets on the cell phones, or the big storm comes through and knocks all the lines down, it probably is going to knock down the cell towers too. So keeping your cell phone as a backup plan to get on the internet and communicate sounds good in theory, but it doesn't work in the real world when there's a disaster. And the only way that we were able to communicate is that Starlink terminals started appearing. That's a space-based system by SpaceX with satellites in low Earth orbit. And some guy just, they started driving trucks into the local parks where people could show up, and they had a generator where you could charge your phone. Because remember, there's no power. And you could finally get some messages out. And some random guy just showed up in our neighborhood and said, here's a Starlink, I'm dropping it off at this house. So the whole neighborhood would gather. So like I said, the one thing that was good about it is that it brought people together. It brought our neighbors together and friends together, and just random strangers helping everybody out, which is kind of what, you know, I would aspire to be. I tried my best to help our neighbors and our friends and just random strangers. And just the ability to communicate was great, because it allowed us to reach out to people and see if they needed help, and also to do work when we were able to. So
it seems like there's some common lessons, right? We're used to living in this connected world where we have access to resources if we need them. And as different as Michigan and Maui are, right? Power is an issue, and connectivity is an issue, whether it be internet or cell. And so, right, one way to solve that is Starlink, but you still need power. And I suppose if people want to stay connected, they're going to have to think about generators in their houses. I know you've been thinking about a Tesla battery, Starlink, right? Good to have that set up if you can afford it. But if the grid goes down, I mean, not the electrical grid, because your generator will solve that for a few days. But what about the internet or the cell phone towers? Those could go down too. And then you're like, man, SOL in either place.
yeah, and it's not going to be an instant fix. Like I said, it was 2 weeks before we got a cell phone signal inside our house, and still no internet, or very, very, very limited. But generally, you'd be, after 2 weeks, you'd be able to send and receive text, or maybe make a phone call from inside the house. It took a week to get power back. At least we didn't run out. The water kept flowing. That would have been bad if that had stopped. Still no internet, but just thankful for the little things, like you had food and water. Like, we had no power. Our neighbors let us borrow a small little generator for the first day. Then my other neighbors have a Tesla Powerwall with solar panels, which incidentally I have now too. And the day before this thing, I've been waiting for over a year. The guys came to install it. They said it's 4 p.m. quitting time. We'll be back tomorrow to finish. Of course, there's a hurricane. The town burns down. So we had the Tesla battery on the wall, but it wasn't hooked up yet. So as soon after that, the fire and disasters, we got them back to hook it up. So we have solar panels and a Tesla battery. And we also, I'm shocked to find out that we were able to find a small generator and buy it. And, you know, it's very small. And the only thing we would use it for is to keep the refrigerator going so that all of our food doesn't expire.
Yeah.
There's another disaster.
You know, it's kind of remarkable, given everything that happened, that those guys came back and were able to finish that Tesla battery. I mean, think of all the things that could go wrong, or all the other things that they could have been involved in. It's kind of remarkable that they came back within any kind of weeks of this whole event.
Yeah. And I was shocked, but also happy. And they almost put me off. They're like, well, you really need internet to finish, and you don't have internet. I said, wait. My buddy next door has Starlink, so we do have internet.
Yeah. So a lot of things needed for connectivity. And if a business has a website, as they do, right, and they need to make sure that they field inquiries, what do you think some things, based on this experience, you know, it's fresh in your mind. If you own a business, and you do, happily it was in Michigan, and we have everything more or less covered and redundant here, but what are some things businesses should be looking out for?
Yeah, well, it was interesting that the roads were closed, the stores were closed, they didn't have power. All of the gas stations either blew up, burned down, or didn't have power. So you couldn't get gas, you couldn't get food. I want to say maybe the Friday or Saturday after the fires happened on a Tuesday. The one grocery store that didn't burn down, that was at the end of the road, somehow they got enough generators to open the doors, and none of their fresh, they had a couple of things of lettuce maybe, but all of the meats and the milks and all that was all rotten. So you go in there and get some ramen noodles and canned food and stuff, and somehow they must have had satellite internet because you could use your credit card. But the one gas station that didn't burn down, that did have gas, that eventually opened, that had lines around the block, it's like nothing doing, cash inside.
Makes sense. It's funny, the Costco here in our town, I've been in there a couple times when power's failed, and they've got a generator system, and it happens to power the cash registers, even though it doesn't power anything but the emergency lights. So I know some smart executives made that decision. And like you say, I mean, on Maui, maybe you do need like satellite backup for your credit card processor.
Yeah, because like I said, if you're thinking, oh, I'm gonna get the cell phone one, either tether it to my cell phone or get the wireless hotspot from whatever cell phone provider. It's like, man, if there's a disaster where there's no power, no internet, you're not going to have your cell phone either.
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy how connected we are, and I know at our house, we think about 3 deep, right? I've got stuff in the freezer, so if the power goes out, I got about 3 days of, as long as if I don't have power for the freezer, I got about 3 days before most of that stuff goes bad, but at least I got that 3 days of food. Next level is we got what we call the zombie apocalypse room, where we have canned food, right? And dried things like ramen that you mentioned. So that's going to get us through a few more weeks. And then I do have a couple of those 5-gallon buckets full of survival rations. Now, last year I went in the mountains with, mountain food. I want to tell you something, you get sick of that shit really fast. So I hope I never have to rely on the 25-year food. Obviously, it's nice if it keeps you alive.
And you'd be happy for it in that situation.
Grateful for it. And right. But if you want to live comfortably and long and healthy under extreme circumstances, there's a lot of preparation you got to do. And it's not only intensive, and you got to think about it, but it costs money. And not everybody's lucky enough to have all that.
Yeah, and also think about, you got all that food in the freezer, maybe, but how are you going to cook it? You're not going to have a stove or an oven. You better have a grill with some propane.
Yeah, well, I mean, happily, I'm a guy that likes to go out in the woods, and either in a car or with a backpack. So I have a fair amount of propane at home. Again, week or two probably get me through fine, right? Not much suffering. Other than that, things start getting a little challenging.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Well, listen, we are so blessed, personally as a company, we're so blessed that things went the way they did for you in Maui. And I'm sure that's a formative experience, which will continue to have echoes in terms of how you think about the world and your life for a long time. Very few of us live through something like that. But we are blessed enough to have occasionally nice meals. And I know you were able to scrape a couple of together during this catastrophe. You want to share any steak and margarita, or at least steak experiences from the wildfires of Maui?
Yeah, well, I feel guilty because I kind of felt we were eating like kings, but the 2 days before I went to the grocery store and I stocked up. So I bought a bunch of steaks and chicken or whatever. And so I had a refrigerator and freezer full of stuff. And our friends came over because they thought, the town burned down. They woke us up in the middle of the night, banging on the door. Hey, the town burned down. Our place burned down. Take us in, which we were glad to see them and happy to do so. But I happen to have this a 2-inch thick Wagyu steak in the freezer. I'm like, well, if we don't have any power and everything is going to go bad, that's the first thing I'm eating.
Yes.
And normally I would reverse sear it in the oven, but I have no power. So, and normally I have a backup tank of propane. On my last trip, I was searing a steak and I ran out of propane, and I swapped the tank, and I was going to go refill the empty one, and there was a strike that propane deliveries were held up, so I couldn't do it. So I only had 1 can of propane, and I had the empty one sitting there. I'm like, well, I don't want to waste this. I'm going to need it. So I couldn't reverse sear, so I just grilled it old school, and it still came out quite delightful.
Love it. Love it. Very nice. Very nice.
So we made do with what we had, and I kind of felt guilty. It's like, we're eating steak here, but I mean, what are you going to do? It's going to go bad, or we're going to eat it. So that's what's going to happen. And we were able to get it wasn't the government, it was the local people and the Maui Food Bank and the boots on the ground there that, you know, you could go get food and supplies. World Kitchen showed up. They're handing out hot meals, like some of the local businesses, like the Merriman's, which is known as being a fancy restaurant. Every day they're handing out, you know, free hot meals and providing Starlink internet for people, and even going so far as to say, hey, if you can't get here, contact us, give us your address, a number of people, we'll bring the meals to you.
Wow, wonderful. Yeah, it's wonderful to see how everybody came together. And you know, we don't even know yet the extent of the lives lost, but
We don't.
as you said, there's I mean, you know, if it was your family, the silver line is going to be hard to see, but for the world at large, it's really wonderful to see how that community came together.
Yeah, and you know, there are still a lot of people suffering who lost their homes, their cars, and their jobs, and whatever else. And the government is trying to help. They eventually showed up, but you find it in your hearts and want to help support them, I would recommend donating directly to the people who are on the ground doing the work. And one such fund would be honokauairelief.com. Just a bunch of volunteers showed up, took over the beach park. There's deliveries every day. You can get food, water, medical care, massages, mental health. So it's making a difference.
All right, good. Now I'll prompt you after this, but please send that information to our young Emily after this podcast, who posted to make sure she gets that in some text as well. That'll help. And I know, you know, our company donated some money to Maui Food Bank, and I believe personally you've done so as well. And I'm going to continue to help support that effort. Crazy time in Maui. All of my complaints about steak are first world complaints, and so I don't know that they belong on this particular podcast. So I will hold them in abeyance until we resume next week with something a little more mainstream. Any final thoughts before we wrap up this Maui reflection and SEO and connectivity podcast?
Well, we know that things can happen and things can change in the blink of an eye. If you can, it's best to be prepared. If the worst happens, you'll be very thankful that you have food, water, and shelter. And people will be very thankful of you if you can be abundant and share it with them. So, you know, we were able to share some things with our neighbors who were very generous with us. So give till it hurts.
Give till it hurts. Rock and roll. That's a great way to end. Thank you, sir. See you next week.